Well, I'm back on the moors today and it's a little calmer. We found a place that's not on the top of the moor, which is always a winner, but I'm with Alan Clark again, and today we're doing our second episode about aircraft wrecks in and around this particular patch of the Longdendale reservoirs. Last time we were over by Tintwistle Knarr, so if you haven't listened to that one, do go check that one out. But today we're not too far away from Bleaklow, and we are above, what's this? What did we say? Rosewood and Torside.
Rosewood.
Yeah. We have been and done our walk, so we're just going to sit still today, because trying to record and walk on moorland in this kind of heather, you're never going to hear one of us, I think. So we decided to sit down and actually pay respects, because we are sat with our feet right next to a memorial. This one is a memorial for Bramah Edge. We're going to talk about some of the many crashes that happened in this particular area. I mean, I did a bit of a summarise from your website, Alan, peakdistrictaircrashes.co.uk, and within this small radius I picked out 8 crashes. 36 people have died, 2 people have survived. So we've got a few of those to kind of explain, but should we start with where we are today? Do you want to explain that?
So we're sat on Bramah Edge, overlooking Torside Reservoir and Rosewood. We've got the Woodhead Road on the opposite side of the valley from us, and Tintwistle Knarr, where we did last week's podcast about air crashes from.
And Bramah Edge, so this is one of the crash sites where it was pretty late on. It was 1956 when this particular crash happened. Can you tell us about what plane it was and what the journey was that it was taking?
Yeah, so the plane was a single-engine high-wing aircraft built by de Havilland Canada called a Beaver. It was in service with the US Air Force, and they called it L-20, L being for liaison. And it was attached to a fighter unit down in Suffolk. They operated F-84 Thunderjet fighter bombers, but the L-20 was used for moving personnel and equipment about the country. And on the day that it crashed, it was being used to fly one of their pilots across to Burtonwood near Warrington, which is a big servicing centre for the US Air Force at the time. They'd had one of their aircraft over for maintenance, and the pilot, who was a passenger on this aircraft, was to fly that Thunderjet back to Suffolk.
But he never made it.
No.
I mean, and this was a bit of human error, from what I understand, as to the reason that the crash happened.
Yeah, it was really quite an unusual crash, this one. That it wasn't so much the pilot in command of the aircraft that made an error as it was more a ground control error. In identifying the aircraft on radar. By the time this crash happened in 1956, radar was in use, and the aircraft was being guided towards Burtonwood through cloud and poor visibility by a ground controller with a radar set. And unfortunately, based on the information given to him by the pilot of this aircraft, he misidentified a return on his radar.
I mean, both the pilot and the passenger, or the other pilot, were killed in this instance. It looks like when I delved into the newspaper reports, it corroborated with some of the other reports which talk about a chap called Leslie Simpson, who was manning the Torside signal box, which we probably would be able to see if it was still here from this vantage point, I guess. And he heard a dull thud high up on the hillside, saw an orange glow, and called the emergency services. And actually a car with 2 people had stopped, and they saw the crash had happened and tried to climb up, but by the time they got here there was nothing to be done, and found one of the bodies still in the cockpit and another one had been thrown out. Yeah, I mean, there have been memorials, crosses at this site obviously for a number of years. We've found 3 different versions here as well.
Yeah, and over the years, like you said, there have been several. I think there's the remains. Well, there's the remains of a 4th one under my foot there.
Yeah.
There used to be quite a large wooden cross here. I think that's rotted away over the years and has completely disappeared.
At your feet here, is this bits of the aircraft that are at the cross? What is it?
These are just small shards of aluminium mostly from the front end of the aircraft, because that's what received most of the damage in the crash. The tail and both wings were still fairly intact. There's a small piece here which looks like a tree root. That's a piece that's been melted in the post-crash fire and then solidified to form this sort of tree root-like shape.
Wow. It's amazing you can just pick that up and be like, that's a bit of plane, because most people would just walk past this on a hillside and think it was a very weird shaped stone. Wow, I mean the view here is spectacular. It's reasonably tough to get here. This is access land that we're on. There are fences and a few paths, but not really marked on a map. How would you describe for people, who may be looking at visiting this particular site?
It's probably one of the more difficult ones to get to, even though it's so close to a road. There's no direct route up here. We've come up from the little reservoirs above Padfield and come up round the edge of Ogden Clough and along Bramah Edge itself. Alternatively, you come up the Pennine Way from Reeps Farm, but there's quite a bit of doubling back to be done on that route. It just makes it a little awkward to get to this one.
Yeah, I mean, you have got the grid reference on your website and also in your book as well, so people can find out more, but you definitely need to maybe be pretty good at some map reading and looking for stones. I think big boulders is the key for this one. Let's talk about some of the other... Oh, there's a plane heading just over us now. It's a big one. You'll probably know what that is.
It looks like an Airbus A320.
All right, okay.
Might be EasyJet.
It didn't look orange enough to me.
No, it's a little bit dark, but it's hard. I can't tell from this distance now. It has gone quite dark.
Do you know what? I'm just going to be grateful that I can see, because in recent days I've not been able to see past 10 metres, so I'm grateful that today I can see. Let's talk about some of the other crashes which have happened on this side of the moor, the reservoir side. So Sykes Moor, a particularly gruesome crash. I think when I read the details about this one, I have got to say I was pretty horrified. And I'll, to keep this podcast family friendly, I'm not going to go into the graphic description of what was found, but both people aboard this particular plane didn't make it. So it was the 30th of January 1939, and keep the 30th of January in your mind because that date seems to be quite significant in this area. Tell us what plane it was and what was happening with this particular one, Alan.
So it was a Bristol Blenheim, which was a fighter aircraft used by the RAF at the time. It was a big twin-engine aircraft, later became a bomber, but in its early use it was used as a heavy long-range fighter, and it was with number 64 Squadron at the RAF at Church Fenton, which is between Leeds and York, being flown by two crew, one of them a South African volunteer in the RAF and another from what at the time was Southern Rhodesia, nowadays Zimbabwe. Again, he was in the RAF, but he'd travelled from Southern Africa to enlist in the RAF. They were both new to the squadron, so were given the aircraft for part of the day to fly around the York area to get familiar with the area around their airfield. They'd strayed a bit too far away and had ended up in poor visibility over the Pennines. The pilot flying lost control of the aircraft and it dived into Sykes Moor on the opposite side of Torside Clough from the Pennine Way, where both of the men on board were killed.
I mean, it took 13 days or 14 days for someone to find this. You know, I imagine it was reported missing. It hadn't come back. People didn't know where it was, and the search was put out. But it wasn't till there was a local walker who was out. He was trying to catch up with his friends, wasn't he? Yeah,
he was a member of a local walking group.
I like the name of it, Openshaw Out of Doors Club. I like that.
Yeah, I guess they probably all worked in the heavy industry that was around Openshaw at the time. They'd got the train to Marple that morning, and the chap who found the crash site, he'd ended up setting off late and arrived at Marple after his friends had departed. And I think it was their intention to get the train back, probably from Crowden Station.
Yeah.
As that seems to be where he was heading to when he located the crash site. This was before the time of the Pennine Way, he'd gone up from Marple onto Mellor, then probably Mill Hill, Kinder, across to Bleaklow, across the Snake Pass, over the top of Bleaklow Head, and was coming down across Sykes Moor.
Well, he was having a sandwich, wasn't he? We've got to remember, this is the detail the paper told us. He was having a sandwich.
Yeah,
he already thought it was a tent.
He did. He thought he could see a tent further out onto the moor from where he was, which he thought was a little bit unusual, so decided to go and investigate it, and found it was actually the remains of a parachute billowing in the wind.
Yeah, and then what happened next, I guess, was the stuff that nightmares are made of. He pretty much found body parts, shall we say, strewn around the moor. He was obviously pretty scared and ran down to the nearest place, which would be Reeps Farm, which again we can see it's now at the bottom of the Pennine Way, if people know that, and where the Longdendale Trail meet. But they didn't have a telephone. So then he had to go to Torside Signal Box, who then called the emergency services. But by the time they got here, they managed to get the stretchers up to the top of the moor, but they couldn't find or get everything they needed, so had to abandon the search, come back down, and then go back the next day with RAF personnel kind of there as guards, I guess, to prevent people coming and sightseeing and souvenir hunting. And the identification process of that must have been awful, which was done in Glossop mortuary, but they put the verdict of the death as death by misadventure. I mean, gosh.
Yeah, it was certainly wouldn't have been fun doing that recovery.
No.
Yeah, it was the aircraft was more or less buried in the moor. Period photographs showed just the tail of the aircraft as a recognisable item sticking out of the ground.
Yeah, and another account said that their bodies kind of were found some distance back from the plane, and it suggested that they tried to bail out, but they were, already too close to the ground to actually really make use of the parachutes. I mean, and the photos of the plane were taken by the police photographer at the time, and a chap called Harry Buxton. His daughter Margaret Buxton published some of the collection of his photos of his work over many years as a police photographer. And there, you're right, you can see the plane, and very clearly is the Mark L1476. So 4 years later, so that particular crash wasn't during the time of the war, but 4 years later, to the day, another crash happened not that far away at Birkenbank Moss. What was this particular plane, and what happened here?
Yeah, so 4 years to the day after the Blenheim crash on Sykes Moor, but further east along the southern edge of the Longdendale, a Vickers Wellington twin-engine medium bomber flew into Birkenbank Moss. It was on what was called a bullseye exercise from an RAF station in Leicestershire. Bullseye was a cross-country navigation exercise where there were targets that would be simulatedly bombed. So there would be an infrared light source on the ground, and they had a camera with infrared sensitive film on the aircraft, and when they thought they were over the target, they would expose the film, and then when they returned to their airfield, that film would be developed and they would see if they'd bombed the target. But the aircraft had strayed well off course, and it was while attempting to find where they were that the aircraft flew into the moorland.
Gosh. And it wasn't the only plane that was part of that particular pack that crashed that day either. There was another Wellington. Yeah,
so the unit they were from was number 28 Operational Training Unit. They lost a second aircraft on the very same exercise down near Stoke-on-Trent. That crashed into a line of trees and then across a field. A second unit that was based just into Derbyshire, number 27 Operational Training Unit, also lost an aircraft doing a bullseye exercise on the same night near Matlock.
Wow. Yeah, so the route was meant to take 6.5 to 7 hours. I was trying to work out. I mean, your book brilliantly goes into like the job description. So some of the people on board, like wireless operator, bomb aimer, navigator. I mean, so there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people on this particular plane.
Yeah, a Wellington had a crew of 5. 2 of the crew of this aircraft survived the crash. They're the only survivors from crashes on Bleaklow.
Yes.
fortunate for them.
I mean, so their names were, it sounded like the three that were at the front of the bomber were killed instantly, but the navigator, pilot officer Charles Leslie Grisdale and a Sergeant Miller survived. They were taken to Ashton Hospital. I mean, as a journalist, I'm always intrigued by, well, what happened next? You know, as I'm sure that you've kind of delved in and done some research. And I did look into Charles Leslie Grisdale because I thought, well, I've got more names to work out there. It's a bit easier to track someone down than a Sergeant Miller. And I found a blog online, which was someone tracking down their family history. And there they talked about the same Charles Leslie Grisdale who... Unbelievably, so he had this crash which happened in January 1943. He then returned to work, was part of the RAF exercise going over to Germany to Kassel in October 1943. During that particular exercise, had another plane crash but survived, but somehow was taken as a prisoner of war. One of the camps there. I don't know how he got out of the camp, whether he escaped before the end of the war or when the war finished. He managed to come back, but he returned to the Wirral to his wife and young children. His brother and his dad didn't return from the war, unfortunately, but Charles lived on the Wirral and actually died aged 61 in 1972. So as far as we can tell, he lived a full life. I mean, to survive 2 crashes in 1 year, that's just amazing.
Yeah, I think it was something that happened quite a bit to RAF aircrew at the time, that they would maybe go through a couple of incidents during their training, and then it was part luck as to whether they survived their operational tour or not. And he was lucky to be shot down and survive that incident and be taken prisoner. Many aircrew who were in Bomber Command didn't share that fate.
God, you know, it's like the man who survived a crash on Birkenbank. I mean, I'm trying to see whether when we lean forwards, whether it is just in front of us, further round.
It's hidden around the corner. We can see.
So basically above Woodhead Reservoir, really.
Yeah, it's above the far end of Woodhead Reservoir. So from where we're looking, the furthest we can see is old quarry workings between Wild Buckclough and Shining Clough. But it's Birkenbank Moss is further beyond, on the far side of Shining Clough.
I imagine that will be a very particular tough crash site to find. Maybe you're going up from where the Woodhead Tunnels is, up past Middle Blackclough, like waterfalls along the paths up that way.
Yeah, the easiest way up is up the near Blackclough path. Then you take a right across onto the moorland. Last time I was at the site, there was a wooden post there, and it's one of very few wooden posts on that bit of moor, so it's... If you get a few hundred metres out from the path and you see a wooden post, you head towards it, and it might just be a pile of gravel for the grouse, but it might be the crash site of the Wellington.
Well, and that's it, because, you know, we were mentioning last time how it's illegal to take home any kind of parts of crash, and not all of them have memorials. It's not always obvious. Some of them, you know, all the different parts were taken down away from them, or they've been stolen by souvenir hunters, I suppose. We're talking back, you know, many, many years. And obviously the weather here as well is so... You know, there could be like flood damage or, yeah, all kinds of things that might disrupt the site and the memorials.
Yeah, and talking of flood damage, leaving the Longdendale, going over to the far side of Bleaklow, the C-47 crash site in Ashton Clough, that was almost scoured clean by flooding in 2003. Mm-hmm. There were some quite big pieces of the aircraft that were there then, and following the flooding which affected Glossop Town Centre at the time, those parts have disappeared, and they're definitely still on the hill, but they're buried in all the flood debris down the bottom of Ashton Clough somewhere.
Well, let's move over to Bleaklow then. So it's not technically part of the patch, I suppose, I'm looking into here, but we can't not sit here and not mention the Bleaklow crashes because we're so close to it, and so many people talk about the Bleaklow crashes, one in particular. So that one you mentioned there, so it's a Douglas C-47. It happened in 1945. 7 people were killed. We think the crash site was on Shelf Moor. You added in, I think it was in your book, that you thought that this aircraft was carrying a jeep in its cargo. I mean, that sounds like a reasonably big plane.
Yeah, it was carrying a jeep. There's a photograph of it in the accident report for the aircraft. It looks like that the crew were probably killed by the jeep. It was strapped down in the back of the aircraft, but on impact its straps broke and the jeep continued by inertia out the front of the aircraft.
Gosh.
And unfortunately probably killed most of the crew and passengers.
Wow. There is a memorial there, or there was a memorial, or do you think that this is one of those sites where you're not sure what you really see now?
No, I was there a couple of weeks ago, and there's a small collection of crosses at the site at the moment. Nearby there's another crash site of a Avro Lancaster that has an actual built stone memorial with a brass plaque on it.
So this is the one at James Thorne, is that? Yeah?
Yep.
1945, 6 people were killed here.
Yeah, that aircraft would normally have had a crew of 7, but it only had 6 on the day that it crashed. And it was the fact that it only had 6 that was actually the reason that it crashed, because the 7th member of the crew who wasn't on board was the aircraft's navigator.
Right. Oh, that's awkward, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So then there is another one, 1941. I don't know how to say the name of the plane. So what is this? The Bolton Paul Defiant. How do you say that in like normal speak?
I say exactly the same. Bolton Paul Defiant.
There we go. Okay. You just know like all the lingos of like how to make it sound cool and stuff. I'm like the Bolton Paul Defiant of 1941. In this one was near Bleaklow Stones, which I imagine is a lot of people who've been in this area would know. It's not the one, which we'll get to in a moment, but the rumour was that this might have come under fire from a Spitfire earlier on, although it's never been proven, and it took a month before they located this one.
Yeah, it does seem to be that it was purely a rumour that the aircraft had been attacked by friendly fire off the Durham coast. It looks like it was just damage that the aircraft suffered as a result of the crash that was taken to be possible bullet impacts.
Well, it was 1941, and as we mentioned last time, during the Second World War there was censorship, so there was a blackout of reporting plane crashes, so I guess that does allow a lot more room for rumours and things to be kind of manipulated, I suppose,
definitely.
The story. But you obviously went to some of the military archives and saw the crash reports and have a bit more idea of what really happened, I suppose.
The aircraft was from a unit based in Lincolnshire, and it looks like that it was simply just the pilot getting lost that was the cause of the crash. He'd been up to Edinburgh and had a passenger on board he was an RAF airman, but he didn't fly. He was ground crew, but he was quite a good golfer. And there's nothing that we've been able to find in any of the official records that says why he was in Edinburgh. But it looks like there may have been some kind of a golf tournament between RAF units, unofficially.
Right.
And he'd gone up to Edinburgh and then was getting a lift back in the aircraft. And so there was just the pilot flying and his passenger. And they'd ended up straying into mist and low cloud along the eastern side of the Pennines on the way south. The weather that day around Edinburgh certainly wasn't very good. A unit operating from another airfield close to where they left from lost another Defiant on the hills just south of Edinburgh in cloud. In fact, there seems to have been some confusion with that Defiant and this one in reports of an aircraft crashing on that day near Edinburgh when the aircraft that crashed at near Bleaklow Stones had failed to arrive. At the time, that aircraft was still missing. Right. And then a report of a crash near Edinburgh came in, and there was that little bit of time where it was like, which one is it? And then they realised it was the one that was based near Edinburgh that had crashed near Edinburgh, and this one had gone missing somewhere else along the route south to Lincolnshire. Gosh. A search was started by the unit that this aircraft came from. They expected the pilot to follow the east coast down to Lincolnshire and then back inland, so they were searching offshore in the North Sea.
Oh my
expecting
goodness!
The aircraft to be in the water.
So no wonder it took a month then. You know, I mean, I do wonder who was walking about these moors during the Second World War. I guess people had other things to do, other things to think about. Rationing, working. The factories and the mills around here were actually one of the mills, Waterside Mill, just at the other end of the reservoirs, was actually making parachutes for the Second World War. Wouldn't that be a weird act of fate if that was one of the parachutes in one of the planes that crashed here? Gosh. The other crash, which a lot of people talk about, it's kind of become a bit social media famous, I suppose, the Bleaklow B-29A, which a lot of people go visit because there's a lot more to see. And there were 13 people who were killed, so this is high as shelf stones. What I didn't realise about this was that they were carrying the payroll for US personnel when they crashed, although they did manage to recover that. I mean, what went wrong here? Because 13 people aboard, this sounds like 1948, so it was after the war. What would have been happening here?
So the aircraft is a Boeing B-29, which was a large four-engine bomber. Now, this aircraft was equipped with cameras to take photographs of the battlefield, and was over supporting a bomber unit by photographing the inner German border between West Germany and East Germany. So at the time, in late 1948, we were in the period of the Berlin blockade, and certainly heightened tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. But on the day of the crash, the 3rd of November 1948, the crew of this aircraft had left RAF Scampton tasked with a practice flight. They were to photograph RAF Burtonwood, so that was what was on their clearance form for the flight, and then return to RAF Scampton with those photographs to be developed and tell how good they had been at taking photographs of a target.
So it was practicing really for them when they went over to Germany to do it for real?
Yes.
Wow. And was everyone American on board then?
Yes, they were. It was an entirely American crew.
Gosh. And I mean, were there any kind of reports about what particularly happened on that crash that you could find?
So there is an accident report that's available from the United States. It records that the aircraft was cleared for its flight. It had taken off around the time that was planned, and it looks like what had happened was the navigator had told the pilot to descend, but had maybe told him to descend 30 seconds to a minute too early. To be able to get a photograph of Burtonwood, they had to be below the cloud base. They'd climbed into cloud to cross the Pennines. He timed the flight across the Pennines, thought that they were clear of the hills, and it was safe to descend out into clear air on the western side of the hills. But they descended just that little bit too early and struck the ground just short of higher shelf stones, the last bit of high ground that they could possibly have hit before they'd have been out over towards Manchester and out underneath the cloud.
Gosh. Over the years, this particular crash site has, from what I understand, has changed quite a lot. The weather at that particular part of Bleaklow is pretty brutal. I think that is possibly a nice way of saying what Bleaklow is like. Is it kind of eroding? I understand some parts were kind of buried, and then over the years they've kind of reappeared. And now, when I visited in the last couple of years, there's a lot of different things to see.
Yeah, so over the years it has certainly changed. When I first visited the site over 20 years ago, there was more there than there is today. There was a lot of exposed peat. The site was a mix of black and grey, with black peat and grey aluminium. The Moorlands for the Future project, which has been bringing life back into our moorlands, has reseeded that area, and it's now more of a green and grey, which is a real contrast to when I first saw it. The wreckage itself has deteriorated a bit with age, and it is mostly age now that's causing the deterioration, as the aluminium's not pure aluminium, it's an alloy, and over the 70-80 years since the crash, chemical processes within that metal are causing it to break apart.
Yeah, gosh. And what is there? Is it engines? Is it undercarriage?
Yeah, all 4 engines are there, and the 3 undercarriage units. So there's the 2 main undercarriage units from under the wings. One of those is the focal point of all the memorials and poppy wreaths, and a little bit further down the crash site's the remains of the nose wheel, but it's not got the wheels on it anymore, it's just the leg with a cross axle.
I mean, there was a story of the chap who, he and his son in the 70s took a walk out there and happened to see something sparkling in the sun and realised it was a ring. And then when he picked up the ring, he realised it was engraved, and it was the pilot's ring, and managed to send that ring back to the family. I mean, that's incredible. Even David Jones, who we met the other day from the Glossop Chronicle, he told me off mic about when there was an anniversary where a lot of the elderly at that time then relatives of that particular crash came over to the UK, and that same man led them out on a walk to the crash site. But he said, David said he was there with a photographer, and on that day the weather suddenly turned, as it does there. And a lot of these kind of fairly elderly people who weren't really dressed for walking in a moor, they all suddenly got kind of separated. And it turned out they'd been walking in the wrong direction. They bumped into a bunch of walkers who said, "Why are you going this way? You need to go that way." And as they turned and started walking the opposite direction back to where they come from, towards the actual crash site, the sun came out. And when the cloud lifted, David said that he, the photographer, and all the other people were all spread out across the whole of the moor. And he said it was almost going to be, another memorial of a very different kind. And that really kind of, I think, showed people just how dangerous that particular moor is. I mean, he's not alone, is he, really? This has been, it's a beautiful place to visit. I'm not going to lie. You really feel like you're just in a different planet, I think. Once you go drive over the Snakes Pass, there's obviously an easy way to cross from Snakes Pass. You know, there's no phone signal, and the sunsets that I've seen from Bleaklow have been something else. But it can be that not everybody goes and they're prepared to go and walk to that particular crash site.
Yeah, there's certainly been more than a few people who've got lost going up there. Although recently, very few people have been getting lost. I think in the last couple of years, so many people have been going there with its social media famous status. The various trails out onto the hill have become so well worn that it's now much easier to actually find that site and find your way back.
Yeah, I remembered the first time that I did it, and I wasn't that great at map reading, and I did the whole asking people, is the crash site over there? I did all that, and then didn't have enough food, and I was walking home, and the light was disappearing, and wasn't really sure where I'd wandered off. And you'd said, actually, even with the calls you get out for Glossop Mountain Rescue, that is the bit where lots of people, the same people, do the same thing. You need a sign there or something, don't you? Yeah, so I mean, I imagine for Glossop Mountain Rescue, that's a busy place where you get to go and see what's happened there quite often.
In the last couple of years, it has been busy, but in the last year, it wasn't. It does seem to be that there was that spate when the paths weren't quite so clear and people were getting lost, but now the paths are much clearer, people aren't getting lost, so we're not actually getting called to there so much anymore.
Good.
Which is a good thing.
So the moral of the story is stick to the path.
Yeah, more or less.
If you're not on the path, go back to the path. Let's just mention one really weird thing. So you had highlighted on your website about this particular potential plane, which you thought of, it's a late First World War biplane crash near Torside Reservoir. Just tell us a little bit about what you found out about that. So this would have been, what, 1919-ish?
Yeah, ish. That was a rumour that came about. Ron Collier made reference to it, not in one of his books, but elsewhere. And a couple of other people from the Glossop area who'd been interested in the crash sites in the 70s and 80s had made reference to a possible rumoured First World War era crash. It looks like there wasn't actually a crash at Torside. There may have been an aircraft that fell off a train that was being transported, but again, haven't been able to pin anything concrete down on that one.
And so these planes, what type of planes were they? And I understand, were they being built somewhere in Heaton Chapel, and so possibly would have been on its way to Sheffield? What were these type of planes?
These were biplane fighters built of wooden canvas.
That sounds like a kite.
More or less, yes. It's a kite with a petrol engine.
Okay, so that's one. If anybody here knows, I'm sure nobody knows more than you about a crash, then let us know. I mean, that is just kind of... Look at that, on two sides, one side of A4, I've written in the smallest writing just some of the highlights of the things that we've talked about. Your book, your website go into a lot more details, and then obviously you're doing some of the guided walks as well. You know, for people who are interested in going and visiting some of these sites, you are doing walks. Do you want to mention some more about what the plan is with some of those?
Yeah, so the plan is to do some guided walks to various crash sites around the northern half of the Peak District. There'll be one to the B29 site and the C47 in Lancaster on Shelf Moor. A visit to another site that is almost within view of where we're sitting on the north side of the Longdendale Valley, two Gloucester Meteors, which crashed in 1951, and a North Bleaklow walk visiting the Bolton Paul Defiant that we've talked about, and another crash site near there, and maybe the Blenheim on Sykes Moor.
Gosh, I mean, yeah, you've got plenty to go at around here. I mean, I've obviously been reading a lot in my research about the various stories of people who've lived and worked around here. I've been reading about the folklore, the tales of ghosts and Longdendale lights, because, you know, the area where we are here, Devil's Elbow, is just behind us. I'll be talking about the folklore around that particular part. But, you know, it's quite mad if you are ever walking down below along the reservoirs to look up towards here and just think, you know, the 36 people that died here and the 2 that survived, you know, that their life was possibly forever changed from the experience. And there are so many stories hidden amongst the heather. And it's great that you've obviously gone and done a lot of this research over the last 20 years, Alan, because I think it's important that whilst it's, some people might say, quite morbid, chasing these crash sites and you know, sticking crosses in of Memorial of the Dead or whatever, I think it's important that we keep these stories alive, because otherwise what was their service for? You know, there'd just be forgotten names of people who crashed, and, you know, some of them might not even have gravestones. Yeah, thanks so much. Is there anything else that you want to kind of tell anyone about, you know, with regards to looking up air crash sites? Any tips or pointers of where else to look?
I think the first stop would be Google, especially if you're looking for a relative. You put their full name in and enclose it in quotation marks, and then beyond there there's various websites about aircraft crashes around the UK, and quite a few publications that you might be able to get hold of still. Quite a number are sadly out of print now. A publisher will only do a print run, and then once they're sold, they're sold. But a lot you can still get hold of.
There's always a way, and I suppose that's important why we are doing this project for Longdendale Tales, to create a digital map, really, because we've found with Longdendale Valley that there isn't a library. There isn't really a Longdendale library. We're crossing different boundaries of councils here as well, historical different councils of Cheshire, of Derbyshire. So the idea of putting things digitally to kind of make sure that these stories stay alive beyond the print of books, beyond, you know, the stories that are told by word of mouth by the people who were here to tell it. So if you have got a particular story or comment that you'd like to share with us, do get in touch. You can visit the map, which has some pins of some of the stories, of some of the photos that we're talking about. I'll put a pin of my crazy little grid notes that I've used on this particular episode. It's all at longdendaletales.co.uk. In the meantime, I think we'll just take in the view, really, and pay our respects, and enjoy the fact that it's not raining, it's not snowing. I think we've got lucky with the weather, but we've still got to get back. I've just got to add that caveat. So wish us well, and see you again.